Please take me. She begged the lonely cowboy. I can cook and give you children. The silence on Silas's homestead wasn't empty. It had names: Sarah, Elspeth. The wind whispered them across a desolate landscape that bled grief, loneliness, and bitter resignation. Each thrust of his shovel into the unforgiving hardpan was an argument with God. He wasn't just burying his last goat, he was sealing the final chapter of a life already long dead. First his wife, then his daughter, now this. He was a man whittled down to nothing but splintered memories. He was so hollowed out he barely noticed the figure stumbling through the heat haze. Not a ghost. A woman thin as a rail with terror in her eyes. She was running from a devil he didn't know, only to find a man who'd already lost his soul. She stopped before him, her chest heaving, her voice a dry whisper that snagged on the wind, a plea that would change everything. "Please, take me," she breathed, her desperate eyes locking onto his. "I can cook. I can bear you children too." What drives a woman to offer herself as a tool for survival? And what does a man who has lost everything do when life in its cruelest form knocks on his door? Comment below with what you think Silas should do: turn her away or make a bargain with fate. The silence on Silas's homestead wasn't empty. It had names: Sarah, Elspeth. The wind, a ceaseless mourner, scraped across the hard pan, carrying with it the ghosts of 1,000 dry seasons, and the fine gritty dust of his own buried heart. Each thrust of the shovel was an argument with the unyielding earth, a percussion of grief against a land that took everything and gave back only dust. He did not feel the sun, a merciless white coin pasted in an indifferent sky. He felt only the splintered wood of the handle in his raw hands and the hollow echo in his chest, a space carved out by 2 graves already dug on this very hill. This was the last grave, the final heartbeat on his land, now silenced. He lowered the small canvas-wrapped body of the goat into the shallow trench, the thud of its landing a sound too final, too much like the others. He had promised Sarah he would never be alone. A liar. He had promised Elspeth he would always keep the animals safe. A failure. He was a man whittled down to nothing but grit and regret. He was so lost in the rhythm of his sorrow he almost missed it. A flicker in the heat haze, a shimmer on the horizon. He froze, shovel held aloft, his eyes narrowing against the glare. A ghost, perhaps, come to mock his solitude. But it moved with the graceless stumble of the living, a desperate lurching motion. It was a woman, and she was heading straight for him. He watched motionless as she clawed her way across his land. She was thin as a rail, her dress the color of dishwater rags, her hair a wild tangled storm. He stayed put, a pillar of stone and refusal, as she drew closer, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. She collapsed a few feet from the grave, her hands digging into the dirt as if to anchor herself to the world. Water. She gasped the word, a dry crackle. Silas said nothing. He simply stared, his face a mask of weary indifference. He had no water to spare, no kindness left to give. This world had bled him dry. She pushed herself up to her knees, a feat of will that seemed to cost her everything. Her eyes, wide and frantic, locked onto his. They were the eyes of a rabbit caught in a trap, wild with a terror he knew intimately. "Please, take me." She breathed the words, barely a whisper, yet they struck him with the force of a physical blow. He finally moved, turning to pick up his canteen, intending to give her a drink and send her on her way. It was then that her next words snagged on the wind, and in them he heard the sound of a soul being sold. "I can cook," she pleaded, her voice gaining a sliver of desperate strength. "I can clean. I can bear you children too." The canteen froze halfway to his hand. "Bear you children." The phrase was a dagger of ice in his gut. His gaze flickered to the 2 small weathered wooden crosses that stood sentinel a few yards away. Elspeth's laughter, A sound he had spent 3 years trying to forget echoed in the punishing silence. He turned back to the woman, his expression now hard as flint. "Get off my land," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing rusted from disuse. "No, please," she begged, scrambling closer, her hand reaching out, not for the water, but for his boot. "He'll find me. He'll drag me back." "Not my concern," Silas rasped, taking a step back. He would not be moved. His heart was a graveyard, and he was its sole, grim keeper. He would not allow new life, new trouble to take root here. But as he turned to leave her to the mercy of the elements, his eyes caught on her outstretched wrist. A dark, ugly mark bloomed there. A bruise in the shape of a man's thumb, a violent purple flower on her pale skin. He stopped. The world seemed to tilt. He wasn't looking at a stranger anymore. He was looking at the same brutal powerlessness he had felt as he'd watched the fever steal the light from his daughter's eyes. A force you couldn't fight, couldn't reason with, could only endure or run from. This woman was running. He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that was half curse, half surrender. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He just stared at the horizon, at the endless, empty expanse that mirrored his own soul. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he gave a single sharp nod. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't speak a word. He just turned and began the long walk back to the cabin, the shovel heavy on his shoulder. He heard her scramble to her feet, her ragged footsteps following his, a new unwanted shadow clinging to his heels. The bargain was struck. A plea in the dust sealed in silence. He had just invited a stranger into his tomb. And as the dark, silent shape of his home came into view, he wasn't sure if she was there to tend the graves or to lie down in one beside him. He led her into the cabin, a place where memories hung in the air, thicker than dust. He gestured with his chin toward a lumpy cot in the far corner, its thin blanket a patchwork of faded colors. There. One word. It was all he could manage. It meant sleep here, you are not welcome elsewhere, do not speak. She seemed to understand the unspoken language of his grief, nodding once before sinking onto the cot, as if her bones had turned to water. He did not offer her food. He did not offer her the canteen. The bargain was for shelter, nothing more. That night, Silas lay in his own bed, a rifle by his side, listening to the alien sound of another person's breathing in the dark. Each soft inhale was an intrusion, a violation of the sacred, suffocating silence he had cultivated for 3 years. He had made a mistake. The days that followed fell into a harsh, unspoken rhythm. A contract written in labor and sealed in silence. He would rise before dawn, leaving a portion of jerky and hardtack on the table, before heading out to mend the fences that contained nothing to patrol the land that offered nothing. When he returned, dust-caked and weary, the cabin would be different. The floor swept clean. The perpetual film of grime on the single window wiped away, letting in a pale, judgmental light. A fire would be crackling in the hearth, chasing away the perpetual chill. She was a ghost of efficiency. She moved through his home with a quiet deference, her footsteps soft as falling ash. He watched her from the corner of his eye, this strange creature he had allowed into his sanctuary of sorrow. He noticed how she never took more than the scraps he left, how she flinched if he moved too suddenly, a lightning-quick tightening of her shoulders that spoke of a past filled with swift, cruel movements. He told himself he was merely observing a new tool, assessing its function. But a tool didn't have eyes that held the deep, bruised purple of a twilight storm. The first crack in his resolve came with the squeal of wagon wheels. Jebediah, a traveling trader with a face like a weathered saddlebag and a voice that boomed with unwelcome cheer, was Silas's only link to the outside world. He pulled his wagon to a halt, his eyes immediately landing on Saoirse as she scrubbed a pot near the cabin door. Well now, Silas Jebediah roared, a wide, toothy grin splitting his beard. "Didn't reckon you for the type to finally get some help?" Or did you just get tired of your own cooking? He winked a greasy conspiratorial gesture. Where'd you find this one? She, a mail order that got lost on the trail. Silas felt a surge of something hot and black in his throat. He didn't know its name. It was just rage, pure and clean as a gunshot. Before he could think he had moved between them, his shadow falling over the traitor. She's under my roof, Jeb Silas said, his voice dangerously low. A low growl that promised violence. That's all you need to know. Jebediah's grin faltered, his eyes widening at the raw menace radiating from a man he'd always known as quiet and broken. Easy, friend. Just making conversation. We're done conversing, Silas stated. Get what you need and get gone. The trader, unnerved, finished his business in record time, his usual boisterous chatter replaced by a nervous silence. As his wagon rattled away, Silas stood watching, his hands clenched into fists. He could feel Sayers's gaze on his back. He didn't turn. He didn't know what he would see in her eyes, and he was afraid it might be something other than fear. The second crack was a splinter of wood. He was wrestling with a broken corral post a week later, the dry wood splitting unexpectedly, sending a long, jagged shard deep into the flesh of his forearm. He cursed, a raw, guttural sound stumbling back as blood welled up, dark and immediate. It was a nasty gash, deep and dirty. He was fumbling for his neckerchief, preparing to tie a crude bandage when she was simply there. She moved without a sound, taking in the scene with a quick, practiced eye. Before he could protest, she gently but firmly took his arm. Her touch was a shock, a spark on his cold skin. Hush, now, she whispered, her voice carrying a quiet authority that brooked no argument. A wound left to fester will kill a man same as a bullet. He wanted to pull away, to snarl at her to leave him be, but he was frozen, mesmerized by the sureness of her movements. She led him to the water pump, cleaned the wound with a focus that was almost terrifying, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then, from a small pouch at her waist, she produced a wad of crushed green leaves. Yarrow he thought he recognized, and pressed the cool, fragrant poultice into the cut. The sting was immediate, but it was a clean fire, not the dirty burn of the injury. He watched her wrap his arm with a strip of clean cloth torn from her own petticoat, her fingers deft and sure. For 3 years, no one had touched him with such care. The sensation was alien. It was terrifying. It was warm. That night, the silence by the fire was different. It wasn't empty or hostile. It was heavy with questions. He looked at her, truly saw her, not as a ragged plea or a silent servant, but as the woman who had defended him with her quiet labor and healed him with her gentle hands. The walls he had built around his heartstone by painful stone felt porous for the first time. He had to know. Sayrsa. He said the name, feeling strange and foreign on his tongue. She looked up, her eyes catching the firelight. He gestured with his chin toward her wrist, where the faint shadow of the bruise still lingered. That mark, he began, his voice rougher than he intended. Who gave it to you? His question hung in the firelit silence of the cabin, a stark and unavoidable thing. Who gave it to you? Sayrsa, who had been staring into the flames, flinched as if the words themselves were a blow. She drew her hand back instinctively, hiding the faint, bruised shadow on her wrist. For a long moment, Silas thought she would retreat back into the fortress of her silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low, frayed thread, weaving a story of shame and survival. A foreman, she whispered, her eyes still fixed on the fire. At the mines. A man named Finian. She spoke in fractured pieces of a debt she didn't incur, but was forced to work off. Of cold nights and colder words. Of a man who believed his ownership of her labor extended to ownership of her body. She did not cry. The story was too old, the pain too deeply embedded to be washed away by fresh tears. It was a simple, brutal telling of a life that was not a life, but a sentence. Silas listened. He did not speak. He did not offer the empty currency of comfort. He simply sat there, a block of granite in the flickering light, and absorbed her words. He understood the language of being owned not by a man with cruel hands, but by a grief with an unbreakable grip. When she finished, a profound quiet filled the room, a silence no longer born of awkwardness, but of shared, desolate understanding. He had seen the brand on her skin, and now she had shown him the wound beneath. The seasons began to turn, painting the plains in the pale, brittle golds of autumn. The unspoken contract held. But something had shifted. He found himself leaving a strip of bacon on her plate in the morning. She took to mending the tears in his work shirts, her stitches small and neat. They were two solitary planets still orbiting their own private suns of pain, but their gravitational fields had begun to touch, to pull, to alter the other's lonely course. Then the sky turned the color of a bruise. Winter did not arrive. It attacked. A blizzard descended from the north, a shrieking white-fanged beast that swallowed the world whole. The wind howled with the voice of a banshee, throwing snow against the cabin walls like fistfuls of sharp gravel. The world shrank to the four walls of the small room, the fire in the hearth their only defense against the crushing elemental rage outside. On the second night of the storm, a new sound joined the wind's howl, a low, pained bellow from the barn. Their last cow, a scrawny but vital source of milk, was in labor, and in trouble. Silas bundled against the cold, fought his way through the maelstrom to the barn. The air inside was freezing, the cow's breath pluming in the lantern light. She was straining her eyes, wild with pain and fear. A calf was stuck. A breach. A death sentence for both mother and child if nothing was done. And Silas froze. The sight of the struggling mother, the imminent helpless death, threw him back in time. He was in this cabin again 3 years ago, the air thick with the smell of useless herbal remedies, watching Sarah's life ebb away, listening to Elspeth's breathing grow shallow then stop. He was powerless then, and he was powerless now. The grief was a paralysis, a cold hand gripping his heart, squeezing the strength from his limbs. "Move aside," her voice cut through his fugue state. Saoirse stood behind him, her face grim and determined in the lantern's glow. She carried a bucket of hot water and clean rags. She was not asking. She was commanding. He stumbled back, watching as she approached the distressed animal, murmuring to it in a soft, crooning language he didn't know. It was not the voice of the frightened creature who had collapsed at his feet months ago. It was the voice of a woman who understood the brutal, beautiful mechanics of life and death. For the next hour, he became her assistant. "Hold the lantern here. More hot water. The rope." He obeyed without thought, his own paralysis receding in the face of her fierce, focused competence. He watched, stunned, as her small, deft hands worked with a knowledge that was ancient and sure, guiding, turning, saving. There was a final, terrible bellow from the cow, a surge of desperate effort, and then a wet, slithering sound. A small steaming body slid onto the hay. It was alive, a tiny perfect calf blinking in the sudden light. The storm raged outside, but inside the small lamplit barn there was only the sound of the mother cow's exhausted licking and the miracle of a new, steady heartbeat. Saoirse sank back against the wall, her shoulders finally slumping, her energy spent. Silas looked at her, at the strands of hair stuck to her sweat-sheened forehead, at the fierce life-giving light in her eyes. And he felt a profound, aching gratitude that left him breathless. When the blizzard finally broke 2 days later, the world was a pristine, silent canvas of white. The calf was standing on wobbly legs. The cow was safe. Life had won. That evening they sat by the hearth, the silence comfortable earned. He found himself speaking the words coming unbidden, dredged up from a place he had kept locked and dark for years. "Elspeth," he began, his voice rough. "My girl, she would have named that calf by now. something silly, like Buttercup or Starlight. He looked into the flames, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time in an age. She loved the animals. More than people, I think. Said they were more honest. He had offered her a piece of his heart, a shard of a memory. Saoirse did not try to glue it back together with empty words. She simply nodded, her eyes soft with a quiet, profound understanding, and let the memory hang in the warm air between them. A shared thing. Spring came, and with it the great thaw. The dead land began to stir. One afternoon, Silas watched from the porch as Saoirse worked in a small patch of earth she had tilled near the cabin. She was humming a soft, sad tune, pressing tiny, precious seeds into the dark soil. He watched the green shoots push their way toward the sun, and he felt a terror that was almost indistinguishable from hope. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he finally had something to lose again. Spring breathed life back into the world, and for the first time in years, Silas did not turn his face from it. The sun felt less like a judgment and more like a promise. He watched from the porch as Saoirse worked in the small patch of earth she had claimed beside the cabin. She moved with a quiet grace, her hands coaxing green life from soil that had produced nothing but bitter weeds since Sarah's passing. She hummed sad, beautiful songs in her strange, soft tongue as she worked, and the sound, once alien, now felt like the homestead's true heartbeat. He found himself repairing the porch swing, the one Elspeth had loved, its hinges no longer screaming in protest. He fixed the latch on the barn door, small acts of restoration, small acknowledgments that this was no longer just a place to wait for death. The ghosts were still there, their whispers still caught on the wind, but their voices were softer now, less accusing. They were making room. It was this fragile peace, this tentative hope, that made the sight of the rider on the horizon feel like a violation. It wasn't a traitor. This man rode a fine, dark horse, not a shambling pack mule. He rode not with the weary slump of a long-haul traveler, but with the straight-backed arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him a path. Silas saw him first, but he knew who it was by the change in her. Saoirse had been on her knees tending the delicate shoots of her garden. She looked up, following his gaze, and all the color drained from her face. Her hand, holding a small trowel, went slack, the tool falling to the dirt with a soft thud. Her body coiled a primal, instinctive retreat, her eyes locking on the approaching figure with a terror so profound it made Silas's own blood run cold. She looked like she was about to bolt, to run back into the wilderness that had almost claimed her. "Stay behind me," Silas said, his voice a low command. He moved down the porch steps, placing himself between her and the oncoming threat. The rider pulled his horse to a halt a few feet away, dismounting with a fluid, practiced ease. He was dressed in a dark suit, his boots polished to a high shine despite the dust of the trail. His face was handsome, framed by dark curls and fixed with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. He ignored Silas completely, his eyes devouring Saoirse. "Well, now look what the wind blew in," the man purred, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I must say, Saoirse, my dear, this rustic life does not suit you. Did you truly think you could hide forever?" Little sparrow Saoirse shrank behind Silas, a hand flying to her mouth. "You've got business here?" Silas asked, his voice flat and hard as a slab of rock. The man's smile tightened as he finally deigned to look at Silas, his gaze dismissive, insulting. "My business is with my property." He took a step forward. "Step aside, farmer. You're on my land," Silas countered, not moving an inch. "That makes your property my business." A flicker of annoyance crossed the man's handsome features. "My name is Finian," he said, as if the name itself should grant him passage. "And that girl," he gestured with a flick of his wrist, "is an indentured servant bound by contract to my employ. She absconded. I have come to collect what is legally mine." From an inside pocket of his coat he produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out like a weapon. The law is quite clear on the matter of runaway property. Now be a good fellow and fetch her. I have a long ride back." Silas could feel Saoirse trembling behind him. He could hear her ragged breathing, could smell the scent of her fear. He glanced back at her. Her face was a mask of utter despair. In her eyes, he saw the horrifying certainty that this was the end, that he would see the paper, see the law, and hand her over like a stray cow, that her brief spring of hope was over. Finian saw it too. His smile returned confident, predatory. "I understand she may have been of some use to you," he said, his tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I'm a reasonable man. I'll even pay you for her upkeep. A few dollars for your trouble. We can settle this cleanly, man to man." He was offering to buy her back. And in that moment, something in Silas, something he thought had been buried on the hill with his wife and child, broke free. It was a cold, quiet fury. He had lived in a world of brutal, honest loss, disease, weather, God's hard, indifferent hand. This man with his soft hands and his smiling cruelty, with his pieces of paper that turned a human being into an object to be bought and traded, was a different kind of evil. A profane evil. Silas slowly turned his head back to face Finian. He ignored the outstretched hand, the legal paper, the offer of coin. He looked the man dead in the eye. "That paper," Silas said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, yet it cut through the air with the chill of a blade, "is just paper. It means nothing here." He took a small, deliberate step forward. "She's not going anywhere." The smile vanished from Finian's face, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief which quickly curdled into venomous rage. His handsome features twisted into an ugly mask. "You would choose a half-starved piece of Irish filth over the law," he spat, his voice losing its smooth veneer. "You have no idea who you are dealing with, dirt scrabbler. I will have the marshal out here by the end of the week. I will have what is mine." He mounted his horse, his movements jerky with anger. He leaned down from his saddle, his face a storm cloud. "And when I return," he hissed, "I will take her, and I will burn this pathetic hovel of yours to the ground with you inside it." He wrenched the horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a threat that hung in the air like poison. The fragile peace of the homestead was shattered. Saoirse was still behind him, her body rigid. He turned to face her, expecting to see terror. He saw that, but he also saw something else. A flicker of disbelief. A dawning, fragile, impossible hope. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "He has the law." Silas looked at her, at the raw, vulnerable question in her eyes. His gaze drifted past her to the small, tender green shoots in her garden, fighting their way out of the barren earth. He looked back at her. "Because this is my land," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "And for the first time, he wasn't talking about the dirt, and you're not leaving it." The days after Finian's threat were not quiet. They were silent. It was a loud, humming silence stretched taut with the promise of violence. The birdsong seemed too sharp, the rustle of leaves in the cottonwood tree a prelude to the sound of hoofbeats. Hope, so new and fragile, had been caged by dread. They did not speak of what was coming. They prepared. Silas moved with a grim, revived purpose. He cleaned his rifle until the firelight gleamed on the oiled barrel, the scent of solvent sharp in the small cabin. He checked the sight, his hands steadied the motions familiar from a life he thought he'd left behind. He was not a soldier, but he had fought his own wars against predators of every kind. He walked the perimeter of his land, his eyes seeing not a home, but a battlefield. He noted the blind spot behind the barn, the treacherous ditch near the old corral, the way the setting sun would blind a man approaching from the west. Saoirse worked alongside him, a silent shadow of resolve. Her fear was a palpable thing, visible in the tight set of her jaw, but she did not let it master her. She sharpened the axe until it held a wicked edge. She boiled water, filling every spare jug and bottle. She helped him board up the smaller window on the north side of the cabin. They moved as a team, their shared purpose a language that needed no words. This was no longer his fight to protect her. It was their fight to survive. They came at dusk. 3 riders, dark shapes against a sky bruised with purple and orange. They did not ride up the main path, but cut across the fields using the failing light as a cloak. Silas saw them from the window, his heart giving a single hard jolt against his ribs. He turned to Saoirse. "Get down," he said, his voice calm flat. "Stay away from the door." A shot rang out. The window above her head exploded inward, showering the floor with glittering shards of glass. The siege had begun. The next hour was a blur of smoke, splintered wood, and the deafening roar of gunfire. Silas returned fire from the window, his shots measured economical. He was outgunned. He knew it. 2 of the men, hired thugs by their rough look, were trying to flank the cabin using the failing light to their advantage. Finian stayed back, a coward directing his dogs from a safe distance. One of the thugs made a run for the barn. A mistake. Silas had been waiting for it. He fired not at the man, but at the old, rusted lantern hanging by the barn door, the one filled with oil he had deliberately left there. The lantern shattered, splashing oil across the dry wood. A second shot into the spill, and the wall erupted in a sudden, hungry sheet of flame. The man screamed, stumbling back from the heat and the blinding light, his cover gone. Silas's third shot was true. 1 down. The other thug, seeing his partner fall, let out a roar of rage and laid down a heavy pinning fire on the cabin, forcing Silas to duck low. He was trapped. Then, through the cacophony, he saw a flicker of movement from the back of the cabin. Saoirse. She had slipped out the back while he had their attention. She carried a heavy blanket soaked in water. With a strength born of pure desperation, she flung it over a small smoldering haystack near the corral. A thick, choking cloud of acrid smoke billowed upwards, drifting on the evening breeze directly into the second gunman's position. He cursed, coughing his eyes, watering his aim, now wild. It was the opening Silas needed. He sighted through the haze, the man's coughing silhouette a perfect target. He fired. 2 down. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the burning barn wall. Finian was alone. He emerged from the darkness, his fine suit now smudged with soot, his face a mask of incandescent fury. He held a pistol in his hand, his knuckles white. "You would die for this," Finian shrieked, his voice cracking with disbelief as he stalked toward the cabin. "For this hovel, for this—" Nothing. Silas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side. He was tired. His arm, the one Saoirse had healed, ached with a phantom pain. "She's not nothing," he said, his voice weary. Finian laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "She is a stray dog I took in a piece of property, and you will die for it." He raised his pistol. But the fight went out of him as Silas simply looked at him, his gaze clear and unwavering. It was the look of a man who had already faced the worst the world could do and had survived. It was the look of a man with nothing left to fear, and everything to protect. The final confrontation was not a duel. It was an execution of a foregone conclusion. It was short, brutal, and ugly. When it was over, Finian lay on the ground, disarmed and broken, a whimpering wreck of a man. The threat was over. Saoirse rushed from the cabin, her eyes wild, her hands flying to his chest, his arms checking for wounds he hadn't yet felt. He caught her hands in his grip gentle. Their eyes met over the defeated man, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the shared staggering reality of their survival. He looked down at his own hands, scraped and bloodied. He looked at her safe and whole. The ghosts of the men he had just fought did not worry him. It was the sudden fierce and overwhelming ghost of a future one he now had to build, had to deserve, that terrified him completely. The ringing in his ears faded, replaced by the hungry crackle of the fire he'd set and the soft, choked sound of Saoirse's breathing. He stood over the groaning, defeated form of Finian, the rifle heavy in his hands. It was over. The violence was spent, leaving behind only the cold, metallic tang of its passing. He did not kill him. Killing was an intimacy he refused to share with this man. With a grim efficiency, he bound Finian's hands, hauled him onto his own horse, and sent the animal fleeing into the night with a hard slap on its rump. "Don't come back," he growled into the darkness, a final, quiet promise. He turned and walked back to the cabin, his home, which now bore the scars of their battle. The broken window was a jagged mouth, the porch rail splintered. But it was still standing. They were still standing. Saoirse met him at the door. She said nothing. She simply took his hand, the one that wasn't holding the rifle, and led him inside. She gently pushed him into a chair by the fire and began once again to tend to his wounds. He had a shallow cut on his cheek, and his knuckles were raw and bleeding. Her touch was different this time. It was not the careful ministration of a stranger or the dutiful care of a servant. It was a claim. Her fingers were warm on his skin, a steady grounding pressure that spoke of a shared future fought for and won. When she was done, she knelt before him, her eyes searching his face in the flickering firelight. "You could have let him take me," she whispered the words, not an accusation, but a marvel. "Your life would be quiet again." He reached out his calloused, bloodied hand, surprisingly gentle, as he brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. His thumb rested for a moment on her cheek. It was the most vulnerable gesture he had made in his life. "This place—" He began, his voice a low, rough thing. "It was a grave. My grave. I was just waiting my turn." His gaze drifted around the small, scarred room. "Then you came, and you planted a garden." The simple words held the weight of his entire transformation. He looked back at her, his eyes clear and free of the ghosts that had haunted them for so long. "I told you that you weren't leaving my land," he said. "I was wrong." She flinched, a flicker of the old fear returning to her eyes. "No, Saoirse," he murmured, his hand still cupping her face. "You are my land. You're my home." Tears welled in her eyes, silver tracks in the firelight. She leaned into his touch, a final, complete surrender to the hope she had been too afraid to name. And there, in the quiet ruin of the cabin they had defended together, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, aching relief. It was the taste of sunrise after a long, dark night. A promise. The seasons turned again. Summer arrived, blanketing the plains in a riot of green and gold. The garden Saoirse had planted now overflowed with life, its colors of vibrant rebellion against the memory of the barren soil. The cabin window was repaired, a small box of wildflowers now sitting on its sill. Silas stood on the porch watching the sunset. He was not idle. He was carving a small wooden bird, its wings outstretched, a gift for the cradle he had spent the last month building. He heard the cabin door open and turned. Saoirse walked toward him, her step sure and easy, a soft smile on her lips. Her body was full with new life, a gentle curve beneath her simple dress. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and they watched the sky bleed into twilight. The wind still blew across the plains, but it no longer carried the names of the dead. It carried the scent of blooming flowers, the promise of rain, and the quiet, hopeful sound of their shared future. The silence on Silas's homestead was finally truly empty, and it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard.